Alrighty, everybody, settle down, settle down. It is time for your Left Communist Radio Hour. This is the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast. My name is Uriah Mark Todorov.
And my name is Owen Gilbert.
You'll tighten that gap up in post, right?
No, I'll extend it to like longer.
Great.
Maybe add some echo.
Nice. All right. So, how you doing, Owen?
I'm doing pretty good today. It's like 4 degrees outside, so I'm pretty bundled up. Also, all that I've consumed in the last 48 hours is coffee grounds, salts, and borax, which is floor cleaner.
Why are you eating borax?
Apparently, it's like got like trace minerals in it that are like good for you. I read this on like a GeoCities website.
I see.
Right.
So you're eating like a natural bleach. That's how I use borax as like a kind of bleach substitute that is less harsh.
Like I mix it. I have a big mason jar full of salt, and I just mix the borax in with my regular salt. So like, I need to keep that in mind whenever I have guests over for dinner, which hasn't happened in a while. But I don't want to accidentally like give them bleach without their like awareness or consent, because that sounds pretty sketchy in court.
Right, because you're also eating straight salt, I guess.
Yeah, I'm eating fingerfuls of salt because I haven't eaten any food in a couple of days, so I'm keeping my electrolytes up.
My goodness.
And the coffee grounds are just to like, give me some get up and go.
So you're not even drinking coffee, you're just eating ground up coffee.
Yeah, I'm just eating spoonfuls of coffee grounds. It's pretty dry. But
what does boron do for you?
It's like a mineral. It's like quartz.
Like quartz. Should I be eating quartz as well?
Maybe.
I can't really tell if you're serious, but I feel like you are. I fear that you are.
I'm eating quartz right now as we speak. It's helping me with this podcast.
So, dear listener, if you hear any crunching, that is Owen chewing quartz minerals. I really didn't expect us to start off like that, but let's try to move on.
Okay.
So today we are here to discuss, we are gathered here in the house of our Lord, Zoom, to discuss Spontaneity, Mediation, and Rupture, the final essay in Endnotes number 3, published September 2013. And this essay is attributed to the Endnotes Collective. What did you think of it, Owen? How many like red star emojis would you give it?
Ooh, red star emojis. I'm gonna give it a solid like 3 3/4, maybe
3
4.
3/4. Interesting.
Out of 5, not out of 10. It was like, it's well written, it's concise, it's like very self-contained, which is like, I think certainly not so much a problem on Endnotes' part, but a problem on our part that we've run into with a few essays in this volume where like, they perhaps like come off as a bit oblique if you're not super familiar with like certain key concepts. This essay, however, was like, you can go into it pretty much like dry on the subject matter and like get all the information you need. I wasn't mind blown by any of it. Like, I think if you've been following the Endnotes journal up to this point, like a lot of the ideas they like bring forth here are like kind of an expansion of like previously established ideas rather than like anything like radically new, but I think for that it works well. It like kind of like clarifies and consolidates certain information regarding what exactly communization theory is and like what it is as a process.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty well written as well. I mean, unlike you, I am comfortable saying that the difficulty of some of the essays in this volume are not our faults. It is their faults for doing such a bad job. Just kidding. But yeah, this one is yeah, it's quite well written, pretty easy to understand. I feel like it's probably written by the same person who wrote like the big essay on the protest wave in the UK. Just because like there's kind of like a continuity between the styles. I'm trying to like figure out try to like notice like stylistic similarities and parallels between like the different anonymously authored essays. And I also noticed that the references to Kant, which reminds me of, and Hegel as well, like pretty deep cuts from Hegel, which reminds me of the history of subsumption, or was that what it's called?
Oh yeah,
Something about
yeah.
subsumption
Yeah.
from
The one
Endnotes number
from
2.
volume two,
Yeah,
where
there are
they
a
get
lot
pretty
of
deep into the.
yeah, a lot of references to Kant and Hegel in that essay. So yeah, I wonder if they're all written by the same person or whatever.
I
Anyway,
mean, it's always nice when they bring in some like straight up philosophy, and because they
yeah,
don't actually do that much.
I thought the Kant references or citations in this essay were really good. I really love when people bring in Kant. I'm a big Kant head. Um, but yeah, I thought it was pretty good. Like I don't think it was mind blowing or anything, but I think it's really nice to hear to read these kinds of theories of revolution that are kind of like temporalized in a way. Like you can see that it is being written at a specific moment, and it's like written for a specific moment. It's written for like our present. It's not, I don't know, like sometimes when you read like revolutionary theory, it feels like it's like often they're from like a long time ago, and it feels like it's written for a long time ago, or it's written for like a kind of like timelessness. It's more, I don't know, it's more timeless in a way. It's more like abstract. But this one, it felt nice to be able to kind of like identify with it. Like there's kind of like a bit of a like an emotional tone to it as well, that it felt nice to, I don't know, feel like this was being written by a peer who like lives in the same world as us and is like really doing a serious job of theorizing revolution.
Yeah. That's like something I've really appreciated about this volume, where it is written within like last decade. I would assume that all of it is from the last decade, and it does feel like quite contemporaneous. And like, if anything, like the themes they touch on, like social atomization and things like that, have only come more to the forefront in like the years subsequent to like the publishing of this edition.
Yeah, like nothing has really changed. Like the it's very prescient, all the stuff that they're talking about in this issue, like the major themes of like protest and like riot waves and I don't know, like blockading, for example, and like this essay, like there, it's just very relevant to our current times, the year 2020, everything that's been going on this year.
Yeah, this is like something that they've sort of developed throughout this volume, is this idea that like, these protest waves that are happening in different years or in different places, they're not like isolated incidents, but they're part of like a growing trend, which, there's going to be lulls and peaks, but like overall, the trend seems to be like towards more escalation and more like social unrest.
I think that brings us pretty well into the first little section here, which is a kind of like history, like a very brief history of the mass strike in Europe, which they kind of want to develop as like a very like a important tactic throughout the history of 20th century like struggle against capitalism. And the kind it relates to the point that in order to do a revolution you need to like develop over the course of decades, because the mass strike was really developed over the course of decades in Europe, and it like traveled around countries. I think, where did they say it started? It started in Belgium and Sweden, I guess,
Yeah.
as a means for pressing for universal male suffrage, then spread to the Netherlands and Russia before arriving in Italy in 1904 as a protest against the violent repression of workers' uprisings. So yeah, it spread throughout all these different European countries, and then it became like very pivotal to the Russian revolutions of 1905 and then 1917.
They point out that like for a lot of like the like union bosses and representatives, like the organizers trying to bring about some sort of like change in conditions for the workers, they were actually kind of like wary of the mass strike as a form of protest. Like they were, a lot of them were kind of against it because they appeared to be like very like messy and disorganized, and if anything they kind of got in the way of their own sort of methodical attempt to like develop like a plan over time. And yet despite all of that, the mass strike spread quite easily because it was this like organic emergent phenomenon. And indeed it's like very effective. Like when you have a lot of people who go on strike, people are going to pay attention. It's going to have like a social effect. But anyway, like as they're saying that and talking about how effective the mass strike was, they acknowledge that like any sort of aspect of a previous revolution, it speaks to like the particular era in which it's happening, and that there's different considerations. You couldn't just copy today like the exact same tactics used in like the early 1900s or the 1800s and expect them to have the same effect. So I have a quote here. Were a revolution to occur today, it would have to emerge out of a massive intensification of spontaneous, self-organizing struggles. Those struggles would have to break out and extend themselves across vast geographic spaces in an ebb and flow that lasts for decades. It is only within such a context, that is, in the context of an unfolding sequence of struggles, that revolution becomes possible, not just theoretically, but actually. It is thus also only in the course of intensifying struggles that the strategic questions of an era can be asked and answered in a concrete way.
Yeah, it's a really great quote that kind of like gets to this idea that we've been talking about, that for a revolution to become an actual possibility, it really needs to build off of decades, or just like a long period, some kind of extended period of intensifying struggles and like tactics developing in order to like meet the like counter tactics that are going to be employed by the state, by the enemy. It's something you said. It kind of reminded me of like contemporary calls for a general strike. Um, I know that's like in the context of the initial COVID lockdown, there are a lot of people calling for like a rent strike and like a general strike. And there are certain like online organizers who are just like that. That's kind of like what their entire strategy is formed around, is the idea of you know building towards a general strike. Like everything that they're doing in terms of like developing consciousness and developing like theory is based around a general strike. And to me, I mean, obviously that is very limited, because a general strike is not going to be a revolution. A general strike is like is one small step on the road to revolution, which really requires like seizing power, not just like abnegating power. Um, but it also like a general strike is really like in that way it is taken to be like a strategy. It's like the thing at the end of the road that all the like intermediate steps that you take are directed toward. But I feel like in the as it is being framed in this essay, in this history, in terms of like spontaneity and whatnot, like the general strike and mass strikes are really taken to be as tactics. They're like kind of in immediate things that you do in order to in a like longer process working towards a revolution. So that's just one thought on contemporary calls for a general strike.
Yeah, and that does speak to something they get into in this essay, where when they're talking about like tactics and strategies that you might use and that you might, one of the reasons you study like theory literature and also like the documentation of past revolutions is because you're trying to glean strategies and like ideas of how to approach the current situation. These have utility, but it is a somewhat limited utility because obviously every historical moment is like, on the one hand, very complex and unique. It's not ever going to be exactly the same as a previous era. So, if you had a strategy that was like theoretically, divined and like 100% effective ahead of time, like there wouldn't be any of this like struggle. There wouldn't be any of this like decades of like uh, growing conflict because you could just like implement the strategy and it would work.
Yeah.
Strategies are only like partially like useful. They're only going to get you part of the way there. You can use them, you can have them as like goal points that you want to reach, but like the actual course of like the revolution is something that's going to emerge like over time in response organically to like the particularities of like the era.
Yeah, the idea of a general strike, like just in order, like it's a really powerful idea because I think that we can all see immediately, um, like the kind of effect that like a general strike, meaning like a mass social wide work stoppage would have on the economy. It would be like it's like basically like the most powerful thing that the working class can do strictly within the terms of capitalism, but like there'd have to be so much done before you could actually call it, and then there'd have to be so much done afterwards. Like it's really kind of nothing. And like the way that it seems to have occurred in the past was like, we're gonna get into it now I guess, but like it was spontaneous. Like the working class kind of did it of its own volition based on their present circumstances. Like it was the most effective thing for them to do at that particular historical moment. And it made sense then, and it was like maybe the second or third step on a long road, but it was not like the nowadays, in order for us to get a general strike, we're just so far from it. Like it wouldn't make any sense. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, let's try to move into the concept of spontaneity. We're going to be moving through the three concepts contained in the title: spontaneity, mediation, rupture. Um, I guess there is like in a section before then, the coordination problem. Do you have any quotes already pulled
Yeah,
out?
well, basically the coordination problem, it's like, I have a quote started off. It says, outside of capitalist society, human beings are mostly organized into face-to-face communities. When they clash, they do so as communities that pre-exist those clashes. By contrast, in capitalist society, human beings are mostly atomized. Proletarians confront one another not as members of face-to-face communities, but rather as strangers. This atomization determines the character of contemporary struggles. The basis on which proletarians struggle does not pre-exist those struggles. Instead, the foundations of struggle have to be built in the course of the struggle itself. So something they get into here is that like one of the difficulties of like organizing a revolution is that in capitalist society we are just these atomized individuals where any sort of like groups that we form, like say family groups, friend groups, peer groups, that sort of thing, there's this feeling of them being arbitrary. It's like not like you actually need particular people to survive in capitalist society. You need like people in general. You need to get a job, you need to work somewhere, you need to buy your food somewhere, but you don't need particular people. And the fact that this is lacking like really hurts like the ability for people to just sort of spontaneously organize into groups. In fact, like this atomization leads to like a lot of competition between individuals and like individual groups, where they're all sort of fighting for like a small piece of the work pie, and like to like form some sort of hierarchy to have like some degree of power over others. Uh, and this is like sort of like fueled by like the commodity market, where the sort of like conspicuous consumption is encouraged, where you're continuously like encouraged to buy status symbols like nice cars and a nice house and nice clothes, just to show that you're more effectively winning at capitalism than all of the people around you. So a great deal of energy is wasted in like this pointless competition that's constantly being facilitated, and it makes it quite difficult for us as like atomized individuals, even if many of us as atomized individuals are dissatisfied with the situation, it makes it very difficult to come together as a group. So
Yeah.
that briefly is the coordination problem.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that they actually bring up the prisoner dilemma in this section. Um, and like that idea, the prisoner's dilemma, and how it relates to like class solidarity, and the challenge of overcoming like the position that the proletariat is in, where they're competing with each other and they have no like initial basis for cooperation. Like it's really in their rational best interest to, just like it is in the prisoner's dilemma, it's in their best interest to, be self-interested, and solidarity is actually irrational. Basically you have two criminals who are involved in some crime or whatever, and they both get busted, but they don't have, like, the cops don't have like real like damning evidence, so they separate the prisoners and are like interrogating them, and like to each prisoner, the cops offer the solution that if they rat out the other person, then they will get off, either scot free or with like a more lenient punishment. So, in that situation where they don't necessarily know what the other person is going to do, it is in their best interest, rationally speaking, in terms of like game theory, for them to rat out the other person and behave in their own interests and like preserve themselves, because they don't know what the other person, like if the other person rats them out, then they're the one who gets and they remain silent, then they're the one who gets like the greater punishment, and they suffer. But yeah, like that kind of like approach to class consciousness and like class participation and strategy and whatnot is like it's something that like you get a lot in analytic Marxism, which is like a kind of like Anglo-American um, way of thinking about Marxism and like communism and whatnot. But I feel like I just don't read enough about it. Like it's really not in the more kind of continental, like Western Marxist tradition, this idea of like approaching class consciousness with like a more like a kind of scientific kind of mindset. Like that idea of the prisoner's dilemma, like they kind of solve it here in this essay. Like you really have to have like an initial basis in solidarity in order to,
Yeah,
you have to like already be committed to being irrational together, and then you can like kind of like protect yourself from the cops in that way. Like if you're already engaged in riot or revolution or whatever, if you already have that initial like footing, that initial basis, then you don't have to think about like these things in these terms of like black and white, rational, irrational, self-preservation or whatnot, because you have this like solidarity is really, you need to have like a basis in solidarity in order to behave irrationally together, in order to overcome this challenge of capitalist atomization.
It's almost like in a sense the situation needs to already be there to like build off of, because like, if you're in like a situation where capitalism is like quote unquote functioning well, like the capitalist society is kind of like just trucking along, like on a species level, it would make no sense to continue inhabiting this system. Like, oh, look at all the environmental degradation and like these like long-term effects of like the declining rate of profit and like all of that. Like all of these things that if you zoomed out to like the species level, it'd be like, why is this species, this planet, like continuing to engage in this like social structuring that isn't particularly satisfying or like conducive to long-term survival and prosperity? But on an individual level, in a society where like capitalism is a functional option, it makes sense to pursue capitalism, because like you have this sense that everyone is greedy, everyone is out to get you, and that if you don't compete, you're gonna like move down in the hierarchy, you're gonna like, be in a shittier situation, your kids will be in a shittier situation, like you'll have less and less power. Whereas if you compete and screw over others, like you're gonna maybe have more power and preserve your own status. So like on an individual level, it makes sense to be a capitalist. Um, but if you have like some sort of situation, some sort of crisis, some sort of like revolt, that's where the potential lies, because like that actually is like a foundation upon which you can base like some sort of irrational in the eyes of capitalist society, like solidarity with others who might be interested in like pursuing that revolt.
This is why we talk about class consciousness. That is like kind of what class consciousness as an idea is trying to get at. It's trying to like build a basis of solidarity between people so that people can begin, the proletariat person can begin like acting as a class in their class interest rather than in their individual interests. And acting in your class interest is, on the face of it, perhaps in a certain context, in a certain framing, it can be seen as irrational. So we see this dilemma at all levels of society. You see it, when you're thinking about at the macro level of like a global international communist revolution. But even if you've ever like thought about organizing like a particular workplace, for example, you see it playing out there as well, where like it doesn't make any sense if you're going from zero to union at your job. It doesn't make any sense for your coworkers to want to like put themselves on the line in order to like do something that is like very contingent in the first place. Like it's totally not, it takes a lot of work to build a union. It takes a lot of perseverance, and there's a chance that everybody gets fired. So it doesn't really make much sense for the individual worker to commit to that unless they already have some ideas about it, unless they're already kind of committed to it, unless they already have that kind of like a socialistic mindset of solidarity with their workers.
Yeah, I guess this is why like in general often like there's this feeling that like revolutions are born out of necessity rather than just like an intellectual decision.
Yeah, which is another nice segue into this concept of spontaneity.
Oh, damn.
Spontaneity, generally we see it as something that arises kind of automatically or like naturally in response to the external world. But the way they are developing it here in the Kantian sense is as something that is done, I don't know, like out of freedom of one's will, that is, chosen rather than, you know, just arising naturally.
They define the word spontaneous, and they do this for each of the three spontaneity, mediation, rupture. They kind of give like a definition of the word itself, which I found useful, because like they, it points out certain like assumptions that are baked into like the word that they kind of want to like unpack. So I have a quote here: "A spontaneous act is one that is freely undertaken. The word spontaneous derives from the Latin sponte, meaning of one's own accord, freely, willingly. In this sense, spontaneity is not about acting compulsively or automatically. It is a matter of acting without external constraint. We participate in capitalist social relations every day by going to work, by making purchases, etc. But we are free to decide not to do that, whatever the consequences may be. And in fact, those consequences are sometimes severe because our participation in capitalism is not a choice, but rather a compulsion. So when they're talking about spontaneous action, I think like, I don't know about others, but when I hear the word spontaneity, there's like this initial like image of like something that's kind of just done automatically, done without thinking, done kind of like, oh, that was just sort of spontaneous. Like there's no clear like initiating force. It just kind of randomly happened. But I think what they're trying to get at here is that like the spontaneous act is one that's done like of free will. It's something that like you're consciously deciding to do as like a conscious actor in the moment without being compelled by like, you know, the society you inhabit. It's not like going to work where you're sort of obligated to go to your job. Even if you quit, like in the broad sense, you're obligated to have a job and to continue working if you want to survive. In contrast, the spontaneous act, which is like, say, a revolt, is something that you're consciously deciding to do out of your own free will against the compulsion of your society. It's something that you're freely choosing, despite like what sort of consequences it might have. Yeah, if you look at like a revolt, like a genuine revolt, it's usually something that emerges unexpectedly. People don't plan to have a revolt. They might plan to have a protest demonstration, but like an actual revolt is something that tends to emerge from like an unexpected situation. I think like they use like a change in the price of a certain food stuff as an example, like which pushes people over the edge and kind of like sparks off like this big spontaneous like eruption of like social unrest. And I think to use a contemporary example, you could look at the situation in the United States this year where, you know, with the murder of George Floyd, you've obviously had many cases of like perceived like police brutality and like you know, just improper conduct that happen all the time. Like there's like hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of this a year, and like many of them are even like well known, where you know the names of the person this is involved. And yet, something about this particular case sparked like a much larger response than many of these other cases, which in many ways would have seemed on paper to be completely equal. And I think this is like a good illustration of the idea of spontaneity, where like the thing that actually sparks the big wave of protest, the big wave of social unrest, isn't something that can be predicted. It's like something that just kind of spontaneously happens at the right moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that if you look at like the history of kind of like attempts to do a revolution, you'll find so many cases where like organizers, activists like tried to provide the conditions for, you know, setting something off like the George Floyd protests, but they failed. Like there's so many protests happening every day, so many like people marching through streets chanting about one injustice or another, but they don't really get picked up. It doesn't really take off in anything beyond like a one-time demonstration kind of. But then you have like something like the George Floyd protest, which I'm pretty sure that it began just as like a vigil or some kind of like memorial vigil, but then because of so many like factors, and it was definitely organized, like people called other people to be at a certain place at a certain time, but because of so many factors that you can't really predict. I mean, in hindsight you can say like the lockdown and like the all of the, you know, police brutality up to that point, and you know, maybe the Trump presidency and all these other things, you can say, you can see how they all contribute to turning this like one thing that nobody knew would become something so much greater into this like huge nationwide wave of protests and riots and looting that would, get like all kinds of like armed lockdowns and like curfews in major cities, and like the National Guard being deployed, and like DHS becoming like the Gestapo and everything.
Autonomous zones being
Oh
erected,
yeah,
like,
totally.
just to a degree that like nobody could have predicted from like, I mean, like obviously in retrospect, like anything else, when you look with hindsight, it's like, well, clearly like something like that was going to happen eventually when you think of all these factors. But yeah, that is something they also mention here, is like the idea of the militant, and the militant is someone who has like an active interest in sparking like these sort of revolts and revolutions, and they're continuously like going around looking for situations where there's like this latent potential or like widespread like revolt to emerge, and they're trying to like fan the flames basically, like to like bolster it, to like, use it to snowball to some sort of genuine like social revolution.
Right.
But like they only have limited power to do that, because like the nature of the revolt is that it's sort of a like a creative act, and if you try to like impress upon it too much with like your predefined vision of like what the revolution's going to look at, like you run the risk of like stifling that like raw creative energy that's emerging.
Yeah, I mean, the militants plays like a very significant role, both like as you say, they have the potential of stifling, but we've also been talking about how, a revolution really needs to, it depends on like a long cycle of protest movements, and it's really the militant. I'm pretty sure they say this, but it's like the militant carrying on knowledge from one cycle to another that allows these cycles to develop in intensity, and like reach a point where it can actually potentially become a revolution, or like start off like a civil war, or like become something way more serious than whatever it was that it was initially set out to be. Yeah, I think like the concept of spontaneity, it that is how you're going to get like an in the moment kind of present tense overcoming of the prisoner's dilemma that we talked about, like the atomization between the proletariat and their alienation from each other, and like the lack of any kind of real like social bonds that really tie people together as a class, as like a even just like a bigger demographic than like affinity bonds, for example. But like you kind of need this spontaneous element, this like people coming together for one thing, but then that thing turning into something else, people coming together for a vigil, and then that vigil like turning into a mass riot or a protest or whatever. You need that like that initial spark of like people choosing without compulsion, choosing of their own free volition to participate in something, in order to you know get over the alienation between people. Like the people, like the prisoners need to choose to you know participate, to behave in a way that is doesn't make much sense in a certain context, in order for them to potentially be able to get rid of that context altogether. And as this spontaneity develops, as the vigil turns into a riot, then um, as they say here, as the walls fall, individuals' sense of collective power increases. The risks of participation drop as more and more people participate. In its unfolding, the struggle builds its own foundations. So, yeah, they have like a whole series of points here. We've kind of spoken about them, but I think it's important to talk about like the creative aspect of spontaneous demonstrations, of people coming out of their own free will and participating in these kinds of collective struggles. Is it that they talk about how it's disruptive? It like interrupts the normal, day-to-day operations of society, but it's also creative in a sense. And these kind of spontaneous demonstrations like create new forms of struggle.
Yeah, and I think here is where we can see a couple of like potentialities for the militant or for the organizer, because basically like the initial spontaneous emergence of like the revolt is something that just kind of happens because like, you know, rationally, if you're just like working your job, going about your day, and you're like an atomized individual, like it doesn't make rational sense to revolt or to protest. Like it makes sense to just sort of like keep things flowing. So you need sort of this initial kind of perhaps like emotional push to engage in what initially appears to be an irrational behavior. But as you get like a large enough number of people who are engaging in that, like you actually begin to like creatively create the potential for like something new, for something that could actually be the grounds of like a revolution. And I think the role of the militant is like when they see something like that emerging, on the one hand, they can do what they can to like keep that energy flowing into this new thing, to like make sure it doesn't dissipate. People don't just go back to normal, so to speak. And then once it gets to sufficient size where it actually has the potential of like, you know, erecting change in society, it has some degree of power. Like you do need organization to begin to direct that once it actually has like the potential to make change.
Right. I'm just going to read this quote here because I think it's really good. Um, Militants are the human traces of past conflict, mobile across time and space. If there are local or national histories of struggle, that is partially because militants establish continuities of experience. Strong militant formations can become agents of intensification in the present. However, in trying to apply lessons learned in the past to an ever changing present, militants run the risk of trivializing the new in the moment of its emergence. This is dangerous. This is a dangerous position insofar as it remains axiomatic for us that we have to put our trust in the new as the only way out of capitalist social relations. So I think this quote, I mean, it really like highlights and like succinctly like demonstrates the importance of the militant and everything that we've been saying about how, you know, the militant is the human trace of past conflict. They carry on experience from the past to the present, and you know they are the ones who are, you know, remembering. It is the militant who brings the experience of Ferguson, for example, to this summer of protests, and you know the all of the history of like anti-capitalist demonstrations in the Pacific Northwest, in Portland, around like in like the 90s and early 2000s, around like the what were they protested, like the World Trade Organization or something, or like just general globalism. There are a lot of like protests in that area in Portland, like port blockades, massive demonstrations, and you know is because of militants, people who remember and people who participated, that you know Portland has such a like contemporary strong like militant tradition, why they had like autonomous zones and why there are like so many clashes with, you know, right-wing fascist types. um, Also, I think it's interesting here how they say that it's axiomatic for endnotes that they have to put their trust in the new as the only way out of capitalist social relations. So I think, I mean, basically, like the idea here is that, you know, like the histories of like tactics and strategies and how to do revolutions that were relevant in the past are, you know, maybe we can learn a thing or two from them, but really it's in like emergent forms of struggle that we're going to, in like new forms of struggle, that we are going to be able to deal with capitalist social relations of today, which are different from the past. It is definitely true that, you know, the past is different from the present, and therefore, you know, we need like new forms of struggle against them. Like they didn't really have I mean, a few episodes ago, we were talking about logistics and how that really emerged out of the 1970s. And, you know, in reaction to logistics, you have the tactic of the blockade, which is really about disrupting the precarious nature of capitalist trade, of the flow of hydraulic capitalism. All this just-in-time production is very fragile, is very vulnerable to the tactic of the blockade, and that is a new tactic that is more relevant for us today than it was for people in the past when they had they just produced things differently. Go listen to our episode if you want to hear more about that. But at the same, like, I think I mean, it's true, there's a good point here, but at the same time I just wonder like how true it is. Like, are things that new, are people that different? Like, I don't
Well,
know.
I think
Yeah.
there's like an aspect to newness, like I'm looking at this on like an emotional level where like you're gonna have a certain subset of people, like say the militants, who are like in general like let's say very concerned with the idea of like the revolution. It's like something that's constantly on their mind. And then you have like, maybe like people like us, like theorists who are like just sort of find this stuff really interesting. We're also concerned, obviously, but we like to study the literature. It's something we just kind of do in our free time, almost like it's fun to like read this sort of stuff and to theorize about it. But for the average person, like, it's not their primary concern in life. Like these ideas of revolution, like they want to have friends, they want to have relationships, they want to like they want to go out to nature, they want to look at art, they want to do things like that. And these are all perfectly valid like pursuits in life. So I think on an emotional level, where the idea of the importance of like newness comes in, is I think it's like in the new current moment situations and like the particularities of the current moment, that's where you're going to get like a much wider potential interest from people, like who can sense it in their immediate felt experience and like engage with it on an emotional level. That's where you're going to like get people's attention and people's concern. It's with things that are going on right now, even if those things are maybe just like a repackaging of like more long-term or eternal themes of the struggle. There's only going to be a certain class of people that are interested in reading like theory literature from 100 years ago. For the average person, to get them to participate in a revolution, I think you need to be able to point to something that's like happening in their life right now or in the world right now, and use that as like the spark to action.
That's certainly true. It's definitely true and very important that we, frame our contemporary struggles, the struggles that we are trying to develop and build in the present, in terms of the present, and like relate them to, contemporary life, and like a more, I don't know, a more contemporary continuity, rather than saying that like I'm organizing a union because that's what Lenin did, and I'm continuing the tradition of the Soviet Empire or whatever. I think it's more important to like relate that to something in the present. All right, so let's move on to mediation. Um, so mediation, I guess, like there are kind of two ways of understanding this term. I'll just read this first little paragraph here. We usually come across the term mediation in its private form as immediacy, taken to mean now, at once. Again, this meaning is a derivative one. Immediacy means, first and foremost, lacking mediation. What then is mediation? It is the presence of an intervening term. In its early usage, the word mediation described the position of Jesus Christ, who intervened between God and man. To speak of the immediacy of the revolution does not mean to call for revolution immediately in the sense of right now, but rather immediately in the sense of lacking an intervening term. But which term is lacking in this case? So the two terms that the two ways of like looking at this term, I think there are two different ways that they actually develop here. Is the mediation of like capitalist forms that are like social relations, and also the mediation of some kind of organizational structure. So there are two ways of approaching this question of mediation, and it is and the way that mediation relates to like anti-capitalist revolutionary struggle is it is struggling against mediating capitalist social relations that are like we relate to each other through, something like culture or through something like value or like money, commodities, whatever. Um, but then also like the proletariat in like the programmatic kind of Marxist Leninist like understanding of revolution and the transitionary theory of revolution where you have like you go from your socialism to your communism. There's the mediating structure of the party of the vanguard party, which kind of acts as like a intermediary between the proletariat, the mass of the people, and the state apparatus, which is supposed to be a tool that, in the Leninist sense, it's a tool that you use to smash the bourgeoisie, and then after you have socialism for a while, then you can dissolve class all classes and have a truly communist utopia.
You basically have like, I would imagine in any sort of society, but like at least in the context of capitalist society, you have like this sort of conceptual framework that structures your actions, your view of the world, your frame of reference. It basically mediates between you and like the raw experience of life. And this is what you experience. Like there's these like predefined social roles, there's these like goals, these patterns of behavior that you need to take on in order to survive and like thrive in capitalist society. Thrive in air quotes. Um, Now, presumably, like whatever sort of like society that we would inhabit at the other end of a revolution, perhaps there would be like some sort of new mediating structure. Like I feel like any sort of society, any sort of large like organization of human beings is going to have some sort of structure. What that final structure looks like is hard to say. It's like speculative. It's something that you can only kind of like grasp towards without really articulating in full. It's something to be discovered. Um, so like there's this idea that what you want to do with this process of mediation is you want to erode away the mediating structures that like propagate capitalist society and continue and cause it to continue manifesting throughout time. You want to erode away those structures and move towards something new, something which is as of yet not completely defined, but which you have a speculative idea of. So you're going to need some sort of new mediating structure that's going to facilitate that process. And this is something that emerges out of the Revolutionary Act. It is these like organizing principles that come about that oversee the process of gradually over time moving out of the current configuration of our society towards a new one. Because like they say here, you can't simply like snap your fingers, go from one day to the next, go from like deeply entrenched in capitalist logic to some sort of like completely post-capitalist, like communist or socialist utopia. You need a process to do that.
Yeah, I think it really gets to the heart of communization theory specifically, because communization theory, as like a theory of doing revolution, is really all about kind of like the way that I understand it. It's all about like developing these ways of relating to each other socially and like reproducing ourselves um, as a society in a way that is non-capitalistic, in a way that is, communist, and that is how you're going to like do a revolution. Is not necessarily by like seizing state power or whatever, although I think that's part of it, but it's by like developing these like organizations and these just ways of relating to each other that can be reproduced, so they like gain power, they gain like they become more and more widespread, and then they like at the same time, simultaneously, as they are being developed, as they are spreading, they you know undo capitalism, they like replace whatever need that capitalism was fulfilling. uh like I feel like if you're like that, just that area of kind of like logistics and like thinking about the technology and like the kind of like material structures of society, like that seems to be like a kind of fruitful area, just because like you can kind of like think about it and see like the things that are just completely like technologies that are really, that only exist because of capitalism and that really only serve capitalism and that would really just have no place in a communist society. And you can think about like those kinds of technologies, like identify what they are, like logistics, for example, um, which doesn't make any sense in a communist context. And then, you know, you can think about what you would do, how you would kind of serve the needs that that technology is serving, but absent it.
Yeah, yeah. This is for any of you nerds listening who are like, maybe not so inclined to be like out on the street marching with like signs or anything like that. This is where like, you can be useful to a potential revolution because like we're gonna need people to think of like, you know, these abstract structures, like what sort of things we're gonna bring about to like fill these social functions.
Section 3, Rupture.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm just going to read the first paragraph of this section because I think it's pretty good piece of writing. So, during periods of quiescence, revolt takes place, but it remains disarticulated. The clash between classes breaks out here and there, but then subsides. Periods of quiescence last for decades, but eventually they come to an end. The reemergence of class struggle announces itself in a torrent of activities. A new sequence of struggles begins. Waves of proletarian activity ebb and flow over a period of years as new content and new forms of struggle develop. The intensity of the fight rises, although never in a linear way as proletarians link up, extending their disruptive activities. The articulation of those activities begins to reveal the outlines of that which is to be overcome. In this way, there is a tension towards the rupture, which throws off sparks in all directions. The rupture is, by definition, a break that is qualitative in nature, but a break with or within what? Where do we locate the rupture that is synonymous with the advent of a revolutionary period? Yeah, so basically, like you have kind of like revolts, which are, you know, protests, maybe like riots breaking out, maybe like big waves of them. Um, but that is just a revolt. It's all disarticulated, right? There's no connection um, between these different instances of struggle. They're kind of like localized and confined to a specific context. But then, you know, like these revolts, they grow in intensity and they spread out and they become, I don't know, in the context of the United States, it becomes like a national riot wave. In the context of this essay in 2011, there was that like huge wave of riots and looting and arson and whatnot all over the UK. And, you know, that is articulated because it's an expression by the same, you know, group of people. It's like a class expression. It comes out of like a history. It's developing on that history. Um, but you can see when this stuff is happening, when these protests are going on, when this struggle is like becoming more and more intense, is obviously building towards something. Like there has to be a breaking point. It's either going to be like massive state repression, or, you know, more likely what happens more often is some kind of like neoliberal like nullification via culture. But you know, in its own terms, the revolt is building towards a rupture, which is, I guess, like a I mean, they don't really identify it here, but like the rupture is it's like a revolutionary moment when like you're not just upsetting the normal functioning of society, but you're actually like overturning it so that society cannot function normally.
Mm. Yeah, something they do get into in this section, and I think this is like where they kind of return to an initially established idea in this essay, where you can look to past revolutions and be inspired by them and like, get some strategy from them, but you also need to recognize like the uniqueness of like each historical moment. Something they lay out here with the distinction of like the revolt versus the rupture or the revolution is that if you look to like earliest 20th century revolts, like workers' uprisings, in those situations, you had a situation basically where the workers were unhappy with their working conditions, but they were in many cases more or less like okay with like the idea of the work itself, with like the basic social role they were inhabiting. You had like craftsmen and like factory workers and things like that, where they might want to like bring about a social revolution to get like a better living condition, like a better role in society, but they were like fundamentally okay with continuing to do the sort of like work that they were doing. They were okay with continuing to like carry forth their basic social role. Like if you were a welder before the revolution, you might continue to be a welder after the revolution. You would just get compensated better. The difference today, however, which makes the idea of like rupture and like a break from like the current like much more important, is like now the situation is completely different, where most people find themselves in the surplus population, where they're doing these like sort of menial, like unimportant, unsatisfying jobs which they don't at all identify with. Nobody really takes pride in their work anymore. Nobody has any interest in continuing to be like a cashier in like a Walmart after the revolution. So the idea of like the rupture is much more prevalent now, because uh, I think for like, those who have the revolutionary spirit, the feeling is that they want to move entirely away from anything resembling the present situation, something entirely new. It's not like 100 years ago where maybe you just wanted like better working conditions, but you were like fundamentally like okay with like the broad strokes of like your life and the society you inhabited. Today, like the feeling is like we want to overturn everything and bring about something entirely new and different.
Yeah, and like that kind of gets to how like the contemporary idea of a revolution really has to encompass so much more than just I don't know, like seizing state power and like imagining some kind of transitionary phase, because like we're talking about like they talk about here how there are like 7 billion people in the world, and the idea of a revolution, uh, the revolution today can only mean 7 billion people trying to find ways to reproduce themselves in non-capitalist ways, which is, like a huge project. Um, Maybe it's not, I think it's like huge in a very different way than like the way that maybe we are like instinctively drawn to understand it. Like just after reading that logistics essay, like, um, before, when I thought of a revolution for like 7 billion people, I was thinking of like, how are we going to possibly centralize production for all of those people? How are we going to, possibly have like a, self-organized, democratic, like global trade network? But I think that that is just like a wrong way of approaching the question, and the only solution is that you are not going to have that kind of globalized trade network. So like the problem is not really one of like logistics and central planning, and like, because that problem has been solved. First of all, like Amazon is an embodiment of how like central planning is no longer an issue, and like you could easily extend Amazon to how to like efficiently coordinate trade and distribution for 7 billion people. That wouldn't be much of a problem if you just nationalized Amazon. But I think it's more an issue of like moving away from that and thinking about how you're going to produce locally and actually move away from a system of distribution and trade that is not uh, communist because it is not sustainable. Um, so should we move on to the conclusion here? We're going a bit long with this episode, but there's at least one point from the conclusion that I thought was really interesting and that I wanted to bring up because it's not really clear to me what it means. But so they're kind of talking about it's like again they're going back to the issue of like the coordination problem and like proletarians trying to overcome their atomization and their you know their they're split from each other and the lack of any kind of unity, any kind of like basis for solidarity between them. So they say the impossibility of solving the coordination problem while remaining what we are in this society must be theorized within struggle as a practical problem. Proletarians must come to see that capital is not merely an external enemy. Alongside the state, it is our only mode of coordination. We, we relate to one another through capital. It is our unity in separation. Only on the basis of such a consciousness, not of class but of capital, will revolution become possible as the overturning of the society. So it's interesting that they're saying that this is just like really weird to me. I don't really know what it means, but they're saying that like it is on the basis of consciousness, not of class, but of capital, that revolution becomes possible. It's not through like class consciousness, which is how we have always understood this in the communist tradition, but on the basis of capital, which is really what we all have in common. That's true. Like as a global population, like the bourgeoisie is kind of it's a bit of a meaningless term in like a lot of ways, but just in terms of like population ratios, it's like minuscule. And so like the vast majority of the population is within this category of like the revolutionary agent or whatever. And like really the only thing that they have in common is capital, that they're alienated to capital, that they're subservient to it in some way. So it's really weird to me. Like I don't really see how you could use it as a basis for unity. I don't really know what that means as like a concrete proposal, but it does seem interesting because in a sense it is true. Like it is what we all have in common.
Yeah, this is actually I had highlighted the same quote, like the very same section, and I think it's something they just kind of like. It almost just feels like a tip of the iceberg situation where
Yeah,
we're at like not only the end of this essay, but like the end of this entire volume, and
I'm pretty
they
sure that
bring up
volume
this idea.
4 I'm pretty sure volume 4 is titled Unity and Separation, so they're
Yeah,
definitely going to continue it. So.
that's what I'm thinking. Is it's almost like they seem to be bringing this idea up here for the first time and not really expanding on it, and you get the sense that it's like a very big idea.
Yeah,
So I'm guessing that like maybe the entirety of like volume 4 is going to be like based around exploring this concept because yeah, like I said, like the same quote stood out to me, and they don't really go into detail about like what they're
yeah,
getting at here.
it's very
But it's such like a
intriguing.
radically different kind of way of like framing the situation, and it's exciting to me because I think that's like in general in life, that's like a useful strategy. Is if you've been looking at a problem for a long time, like maybe sometimes the best thing to do is to look at it in a completely different way and see what sort of perspective you get.
Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of Endnotes 3. We've reached the end of this essay, I think. I mean, of this episode. So yeah, join us soon for Endnotes number 4. we have a special episode coming up for you. I'm going to be talking to Jasper Burns, and that's going to be fun. Hopefully, we'll be doing some more interviews in the future with people, associated with the collective, or people just generally associated with left communism.
Yeah,
We
if
only
you're
we only
like
talk
if
to experts here, but yeah, what were you
yeah,
gonna say?
if you're a real big brain type listening, like get
Yeah,
on the horn,
get
reach
on the
out.
horn. Um, yeah, so we'll see you next time. If you like this episode, you should, engage with it in some way, because I have YouTube analytics, which don't really tell me a lot, because, we're releasing like hour plus episodes. So I expect if people are actually interested, they're downloading the file, but I don't have any kind of analytics for that. So if you are listening to this, if you enjoy this episode, engage with it in some way.
Yeah, if you have some
Send us, yeah,
ideas,
if you have ideas, if you have thoughts, send us an email. You can find my email on my website. Everything is linked in the description to the YouTube videos. Send me a message on Twitter, leave a comment on the YouTube videos, whatever. Just, engagement is nice.
because I mean, ultimately, we're not just here to do theory. We're trying to like spark like a bigger discussion and maybe potentially like organize in some fashion.
Yeah, in some fashion. Who
In
knows?
some fashion.
Yeah, we're starting the revolutionary podcast party.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear if you, have read Endnotes in the past and are listening to this, and what do you like, if you think we're doing a good job like talking about it, if maybe you were inspired to read the essays after listening to these, if you were always too intimidated to read the essays and you found these episodes useful, if anybody reaches the end of these episodes, yeah, leave some engagement. It's nice to hear from people if anybody's out there. So anyway, my name is Uriah Mark Todoroff. You can find me on Twitter at the inverted form. Uh, yeah,
And
Owen.
my name is Owen Gilbride. You can go to my website, world3.tk, where I put up all my music. I just put a new album out like last month, and I'm working on another one. I put new albums out fairly regularly. So if you like the tunes at the start of these episodes, those are all me, and you can get them off my website. But yeah,
Yeah,
thanks for listening.
yeah. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah, take
Bye.
care.